Well, welcome to episode 52 of 10-Minute Record Reviews, and today I'm going to talk about the Dave Brubeck Quartet's classic album from that great year in jazz, 1959, Time Out. And sadly, this is not anything remotely resembling an original pressing. This is a much more recent Columbia reissue from some unknown year. So if you don't know Dave Brubeck, and I'd be surprised if you didn't, what you're going to get here is a mixture of cool jazz and hard bop. And it's also music which for the time still has melody much more present in the songwriting and in the playing than would be found in a lot of his contemporaries who were already starting to move in less constrained and less formalistic direction. This is still very much within the traditions of jazz between 1945 and 1960. And again, when you're buying a Dave Brubeck record, you're also largely buying a Paul Desmond record. And there's that sort of cheeky rule of thumb, nothing with an orchestra, so always go for the ones with a quartet, and nothing without Paul Desmond, because without Desmond as his foil, Brubeck, certainly to my ears, often comes across as not particularly imaginative as a player. As a composer is a different thing. And somewhat limited, I think. So he needs Desmond, and Desmond is always the star on Brubeck records. So Dave Brubeck grew up near San Francisco. He went to horticultural college. He was basically punted out of horticultural college by his professors who knew he was a much better jazz musician than he'd ever be a horticulturalist. He couldn't sight read, and this was a problem for his music teachers, and he almost didn't graduate. Amusingly, he had to promise never to teach piano in order to receive his musical accreditation from the College of the Pacific. Kind of ironic, because his subsequent career is very tightly interwoven with experimentation, almost scientific experimentation with different kinds of musical forms. So to have him nearly not graduate because of a lack of formalism is kind of amusing. Brubeck is kind of not a controversial figure, although I suppose at times he might have been seen as such. He was certainly seen as an establishment figure. Of course, he's a white guy playing jazz. He's part of that school of jazz musicians that emerged on the West Coast in and around San Francisco, which came to be known as cool jazz, who were mostly white, often demobilized from the military, and they usually picked up a taste for two things in the military. One was jazz, the second was heroin. That's not the case with Brubeck, but he was definitely part of that whole scene. His street cred, if you want to call it that, wasn't exactly helped either by the fact that the State Department decided that the Dave Brubeck Quartet, which was racially integrated, which was unusual for a jazz group in those days, and was quite popular, was selling a lot of records, would serve well as the face of cultural exchanges into Eastern Europe and other parts of the world and Third World and so on. So the State Department funded the Brubeck Quartet to travel to a variety of different countries. And that association, particularly during the McCarthy period when other musicians and artists and writers were under a lot of state scrutiny, didn't necessarily sit easily with people. That said, he was also well known for canceling concerts where the hall was segregated and he would refuse to play and so on. So in no way is he a regressive figure, but occasionally he is seen as somewhat of an establishment figure. So Time Out is his biggest selling album. It's one of the biggest selling jazz albums of all time. It is an album of 7 songs, all of which are originals, most of which play with, if not outright embrace all the way through, kind of unusual time signatures like 5/4 and so on. And this, of course, is challenging in a jazz environment where there's so much accent on improvisation. To also be working with unfamiliar time signatures. So technically as well as musically, it was demanding for the quartet to both compose and deliver these songs, but they do an excellent job of both on this album. And getting back to the theme of those State Department tours, a lot of the inspiration for the songs on this album come from the unusual time signatures and musical performances that they were able to witness while they were on their tour, particularly in the Middle East and Central Asia. Perhaps because of the unconventional approach and the conservatism of a lot of jazz reviewers at the time, this album didn't get particularly good reviews, but the music on here is of undeniably good quality, and regardless of the reviews, this album began to climb the charts, scoring a top 40 single and also number 2 on the Billboard album charts, which is absolutely unheard of after Elvis for a jazz album. So this album famously starts with Blue Rondo a la Turk, which is in 9/8, although it does move into 4/4 at certain points. The opening is in 9/8. It's a frenetic staccato series of exchanges between Brubeck and Desmond on piano and alto sax respectively, which which create this incredible air of excitement and tension, and then first, at least fleetingly, and then back to 9/8, but then more lastingly, the quartet moves into a 4/4 segment, which is a much more recognizable sound for the typical jazz listener of the day, and Desmond begins to solo over top of that, Brubeck coming in as well. Very widely known piece of music, a lovely piece of music, and sets the tone for what's to come, because although the bar is set very high here, both in terms of composition and playing, the quality rarely descends through the rest of the album. I sometimes wonder whether it's the playing or the contrasts which make this song so memorable. I suspect it's both, but certainly it's also a good example of how Desmond's smoothness. So Desmond, of course, was famous for aspiring to have his saxophone sound, quote, like a dry martini, which he achieves almost every time out. It's a good example of how the qualities of his playing are always a refreshing antidote to Brubeck's addiction, sort of unhealthy addiction, I think, to block chords and sort of hammering out very kind of jarring sections on the piano, which sometimes works and I find sometimes is a little overwhelming on a Brubeck album. Then we have Strange Meadowlark, which is another classic, recalling that these, none of these are standards, but many of these have become jazz standards. In fact, arguably, I haven't researched this at all, but I would be surprised if this album didn't spawn more jazz standards pound for pound than any other jazz album that's been released, certainly post-war. It starts with lyrical piano from Brubeck. It's basically a vehicle for his playing. There's a lovely little airy solo from Desmond that comes in a little later on. And in fact, both Desmond and Brubeck alternate solos of varying lengths throughout this. Most of this is actually in 4/4. It's a lovely little tune. And then we come to Take 5. Now Take 5, of course, is the only song on here which is written solely by Desmond as opposed to Brubeck. And it is the most famous song on this album. It has some kind of claim to being the most famous, well, certainly a good claim on being the most famous jazz song in the post-war era anyway. And it starts, of course, with that wonderful rolling rhythmic figure on piano by Brubeck, ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-ba, ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-ba, which all of us know so very well. This was originally conceived apparently by Desmond as a vehicle for a Joe Morello drum solo, but in the end, inevitably, although as I mentioned, that piano figure by Brubeck is fantastic to start the song and to kind of anchor the groove, it is ultimately Desmond soloing that beautiful melody line, probably burned most brightly in the brain after you hear this. And the song is in 5/4. Notwithstanding that, it completely swings. Sometimes the piano is most effective as a percussion instrument as opposed to a melodic instrument, and this is a good example of exactly how the piano itself holds the whole band together. And although 5/4 isn't a time signature that most people gravitate to naturally when they think about something that really grooves, this really grooves, it really swings, and that I think is a testament to Brubeck's playing. Side 2 begins with 3 to Get Ready. It starts as a waltz, basically in 6/8. There's also a 3/4 section, then there's a move to 4/4 as well, and it's only really when Desmond comes in with a beautiful solo again that we're kind of rescued from this mathematical exercise. I mean, whenever you feel in this album like the mathematics to music ratio is a little too high, it's almost invariably Desmond to the rescue. At certain points, Brubeck gets in there with some block chords, which as I mentioned, aren't really my favorite, but in the end, it's still another fantastic tune. Then we have Kathy's Waltz, which has some 4/4s. Then we have Kathy's Waltz, which has some 4/4 elements, but eventually becomes a waltz. It's notable, amongst other things, for having a short burst of piano, which sounds identical to the melody from the Beatles' All My Loving, which came out several years later, so obviously there's no plagiarism here, but you have to wonder if McCartney was listening to this tune when he wrote that one. Second last song is Everybody's Jumpin'. This is probably my least favorite song on what is a very strong album. It's dominated by kind of these manic block chords of which Brubeck was enamored. It isn't really rescued by Desmond in particular, so I mean, for me, this is one I've never skip it. It's a good song, but it is probably the weakest effort on of the 7 numbers on the album. And then finally, Pickup Sticks, which you'd think from the name would be a drum vehicle. It's actually a vehicle for Eugene Wright's bass, which really ties the whole piece together, and he has this wonderful walking bass line which he uses. Brubeck kind of weaves in and out, but sticks close to that bass line, which is really the anchor of the song. Desmond is basically the key soloist here, though, and this is another amazing contribution on an album full of remarkable contributions, which are basically career-defining for Desmond. So I think I'd be hard-pressed not to give this album 5 out of 5 stars. It is a justifiably famous album. It's inventive. It shows great merit in composition. It's got some wonderful playing, particularly by Paul Desmond, but at times by all 4 members of the quartet. Brubeck was never cool. He was always uncool in his own way. He always did his own thing, and he didn't really, here's a very, very famous album, but it's not that influential. It's not like everybody's rushing out to do super unconventional time signatures after this. I mean, Brubeck did, because this is one of a number, I think there are 4 subsequent time-related albums in which he continues to experiment, some of which are actually quite good, although this is, I think, very clearly the best effort. It's one of the first albums that people think about when they think about post-war jazz. It managed to spread the love of jazz to all kinds of people who were perhaps only passive or listeners of jazz, or not particularly aware, or were interested in other kinds of music. It contains significant elements of risk, and it's brilliantly executed, which, if you're going to take risks, you need to make sure that you do it well, and you do it perfectly, and this is exactly what they've done here. So 5 out of 5 stars.